Hello everyone, welcome to the first of our free online artist talks. I'm Verity, the Culture and Creative Officer at the Rockfield Centre, and I run the Arts and Culture programme, essentially, that's what it means here. For today's talk, we're really excited to have Naoko Mabon here, who's our curator, and has put together this season of talks, alongside Deborah Gray, who's one of our lead artists on the project. Deborah and Naoko are going to begin the session by giving you all an introduction to the series and the project EcoCreatives and what that means, which has kindly been funded by Creative Scotland. So we'd like to say thank you to them too for making this all possible. And then before that, we'll welcome, we'll welcome Thomas Keys, who's another of our lead artists on the project and who's the main artist giving his talk today. He'll be running us through his practice and giving us a deep insight into how he works and what his inspirations are. A bit of housekeeping, I've said it a couple of times, but I just want to make sure that everyone does get the message that we do record the sessions. So if you don't want to have your video recorded, then please turn it off because we host it on YouTube afterwards. We've also got live transcriptions of the talk, so I've put in the chat the link to read those if you need to have that assisted text, but you also have a button at the top of your Zoom window that says Otter AI, click here to open live transcript, so you can also click that to open it. And you can view that after the session, so you can go back and have a look at it. So the last thing to say is we are going to have a question and answers segment at the end of the session. So throughout the talk, if you want to add any comments or questions, then you can just type them in the chat. And then at the end with Naoko, we'll put them to Thomas and then he'll answer them. And I think that's everything. So I'll hand over to Naoko then to get us started. And thank you all for joining us as well.
Well, thank you so much, Verity, and thank everyone for joining us today. We will first talk about the project and how that's begun and how that's going. So I'll hand over to my colleague and the lead artist of the project, Deborah Gray. Over to you, Deborah.
Okay, thank you, Naoko. I'm going to share my screen, which will take a moment or two just to actually come through to your screens and give you just a brief insight into the beginnings of the project. Oh. A bit of an issue here because the bars out there. Right, we should get full screen in a minute. So the EcoCreative Cluster project started last year. It's a project hosted by the Rockfield Centre in Oban, and it last year was funded through the Charts, which is Culture, Heritage and Arts, Argyll and the Islands. Their Placemakers Microclusters project. That's all a bit of a mouthful. And the objectives of that project were to create the Dye Garden as a resource, but very importantly also start to build a network of practitioners who use natural materials and particularly natural dyeing as part of their practice. And Naoko will talk to you a little bit in a moment about the first series of artist conversations which we had last year. But I'm just going to very briefly show you how we got started with the project. So the picture on the left shows the site as it was when we got started at the beginning of last year. But you'll remember that at the beginning of last year, we were in lockdown, so we couldn't actually work on the site until April. And the picture on the right is what part of the site at least looked like by September last year, so quite a difference there. We had a group of volunteers and we really could not have done it without them, because the first tasks were that we had to clear the ground and clean out lots of roots, brambles, and all sorts of things like that. and also the railings, which are part of the heritage listing of the site, were in such a rough state that we needed to clean them up and paint them just to be able to walk up and down the steps safely with the railings in place. We then went on to construct a series of raised beds, very steeply sloping site and with very little depth of soil. So Naoko, Ira and Sheila were really the leads on constructing the raised beds. And in the top picture there, you can see the final day of construction of the right-hand side, when we had all hands on deck for a big effort to get the beds finished off and filled. And then, of course, we were planting out our plants. The volunteers had been growing the plants on from seed at home, following doorstep deliveries of pots, compost and seeds, so that as soon as the beds were ready, we were ready to plant out quite sizable seedlings of plants. And that was at the beginning of June. And it wasn't long before we were able to start harvesting flowers. Particularly, we grew a lot of annuals in the first year, and we invested in a herb dryer so that we could dry them for later use. And in fact, that harvesting continued right into November, which surprised me. I really thought that would probably be done by the beginning of October. We held our first workshop in, I think it was September, using the technique called tatakizome, which is hammering technique for transferring colour directly from plants onto fabric. And that was very successful. So we've done that twice more since then. Here's a list of the dye plants that we grew into last year, 2021, and some new ones that we've added for this year. So quite a range, but as you can see, there were lots of annuals in 2021, and we're gradually moving more towards biennials and bringing in more perennial plants as well. So that's a sustainable way of gardening. And towards the end of the year, in fact, the beginning of this year, we created an online resource about our dye plants. Naoko will speak to you a little bit about the heritage side of this mini project, but this resource, the gallery of the photographs, all the dye plants that we grew last year. Each one, if you click on the picture, it brings up some writing about the heritage of that particular plant and its use as a dye. And Verity, it will, I hope, very kindly pop the link for that into the chat. It's hosted on the Rockfield Centre website.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so I think we're going to run a workshop on botanical printing in September. But I'm actually going to hand back to Naoko for a moment now, and then I'll tell you my side, if you like, of the next project. Once Naoko's told you a little bit about the...
Yes.
About the current project that we're working on. And I'll try and stop sharing my screen, but I seem to, here we are. There we are. Over to you, Naoko.
Thank you, Deborah. So I'll share screen from my side. Oh, sorry, that's sorry. So in parallel to dye garden development, Deborah just explained, we also aimed to weave a wider network of practitioners and practices that also use locally sourced natural materials and dyeing techniques. To achieve that, we made a series of virtual conversation events, just like this event, with the 5 practitioners working in different parts of the world. So the first one was, of course, with Deborah here, textile artist based in Auburn. and as I said, that she's the lead artist of the project. And we learned from the event with Deborah how to look at our land or landscape and capture and translate them into artistic languages on site using locally sourced materials. Sorry. And the second artist we met was Monica Haddock. She's the head weaver at Ardalanish, which is a farm and weaving mill on the Isle of Mull. We learned that how to develop practice which doesn't see growth as in a scale, but sees it as a network of relationships. And third artist was Fernanda Mascarenas, who is a natural dyer and textile artist based in Sao Paulo in Brazil. We learned that how to rediscover our own locality from what is often abandoned or neglected. The fourth artist was Nanako Suzuki. She's a designer based in Japan. Nanako presented her recent textile making project in Yubari in Japan, using Yubari melon, which is a local specialties in the region. And we learned how to enter a community and how can we return something back to the community. And the last artist we met, the fifth artist, was Boubacar Doumbia, who is a Bogoran artist based in Ségou in Mali. Boubacar is one of the founding members of Group Bogoran Kasobane, which is a group of artists who use and safeguard the traditional technique of natural dyeing called Bogoran. Boubacar is also the promoter at Ndomo, which is a social enterprise training local young people. So we learned how to take responsibility as a community for the local challenges. We also invited Lucille Jankire as an expert to support the project. She's an artist, educator, and textile researcher. Lucille gave us a planning session at the beginning, and Chat hosted her webinar focusing on indigo to a wider audience. And this is about the heritage side of the project Deborah mentioned, which is a slightly kind of separate, but still related to our dye garden project. Earlier this year, I collaborated with Deborah and researched historical garden or growing sites in Auburn with support from Rockfield Centre's heritage volunteers. I then developed an interactive digital map online, which you can view and contribute to it through Rockfield Centre's website. And going back to EcoCreatives, in the new season of the project this year, there will be 5 more conversation events planned with practitioners based in places like Auburn, Wales, Bangladesh, and Ethiopia. And actually 2 of them I trust are in this space. So thank you very much for coming. The details should be updated through Rockfield Centre's website and social media in due course. So please watch the space. So that's my part. So I'll return that to Deborah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naoko. If I can share screen again. I'm just going to jump slides in a moment. Let's get this one up properly. Okay, so our next project is that we're going to look at the Gaelic alphabet through trees. And this, Thomas is going to be a part of this project as well. He's going to tell you later on about his side of the project. But the side of the project that I've been working on is looking at using the 18 trees, which are in what was originally, in fact, the Ogham alphabet, later into Gaelic, one tree representing each of the letters in the alphabet, and using some part of each of those trees to dye fabric and create a work where we will make leaf shapes, representing the shape of the leaf of the tree that the fabric was dyed with, and then stitch the Ogham character for that letter, representing that tree, onto each of the leaves. So you can see the one that I've done here is the alder leaf, and so I've dyed the wool fabric and the wool yarn with alder cones in this instance, and made the leaf in that way. And hopefully we're going to have some community sessions where we will jointly cut out our leaves and stitch on the appropriate characters. And
sorry, Deborah, to interrupt, but you need to start the presentation, I think.
Did you not see that at all? Sorry. It's
no,
right,
no.
Let me see.
Yeah, that's.
There we are. So that's, yeah, so that's the leaf shape. And on the right, there's an image there from a Forestry Commission poster about the alphabet through trees. And these are the colours that I've dyed so far. So these are actually these are the Ogham words for these trees, which are similar but not always exactly the same, or in fact in some cases completely different to the Gaelic words. So we have Scots pine, silver birch, that bright yellow, fern or alder, the more rusty brown there, oak galls, which I then modified with iron, elder leaves, which I just dyed yesterday, a sort of lemony yellow, and the rowan bark, which is a nice rusty copper colour. So that's a third of the 18 trees, and hopefully we'll be able to get a similar range of colours from the rest of the trees if we can in fact find all of those trees. So that's that's the Gaelic trees project, and the other part of that project is that hopefully we can do some botanical printing using those same trees, or some of those same trees, at our workshop in September. Do some prints on paper and on fabric that we can use in more works that can be used around the Rockfield Centre. The rooms, as you may know, are each of the rooms in the centre are named for a tree. So we can make back for the doorway of each room with its own tree print. Okay, so I'm going to now ask Bertie if she'd briefly show you a little video that we made last year about the early stages of developing the dye garden. It's a very short video, which she should be able to run.
Yeah, I'll share that now for you all.
Okay.
So when we took over the site, it had been very overgrown with brambles, which a year or so ago had been treated with weed killer. So there was a lot of digging out of roots and clearing the ground. And we're now in the process of terracing, because as you can see, it's very steep slope. Also, there's no depth of soil. We're using timber that's reclaimed, so we haven't actually bought any new timber. Once we've got the terraces completed and filled with soil, we'll have a planting day and get them all planted out. The different dye plants that we're growing, about 15 different varieties, so that we can see what will grow well in this site. About building networks of people who use natural materials in their practice, in their art practice. And so we have, with the help of my co-lead, Naoko Mabon, we have made contact with a lot of international textile artists. So we've got this sort of very local project of literally clearing ground, constructing beds, growing plants, which we will eventually use for dyeing. And so I'll then be running workshops on different natural dyeing techniques.
So the project really pulls different artistic practices together, from global compositions to garden making and workshops like today. We aim to create a banner stitching together the screens donated by local participants and international artists.
Thank you, everyone. So we just wanted to give that insight into the overall project and where these conversations have come from. So as it's our first talk, we'll give you a bit of background information before we head into Thomas speaking. So Naoko is going to kindly introduce Thomas, give you a bit of background information about where he's come from and what his practice involves before Thomas begins his talk. And then we'll have questions and answers and afterwards. So don't forget to pop your questions in the chat and we can address them at the end.
Yeah, thank you very much, Verity. Thank you. It's always nice to see the video to remind ourselves where we started, and then this is where this story going. And now I'd like us to move on to the next and main part of today's event, and to invite another lead artist of this project this year, Thomas Keith, for his presentation. Thomas grew up in Northern Ireland, beginning letter art as a graffiti writer in the 1990s. Now based in Cromarty on the Black Isle, he uses the materials and techniques of early medieval insular scribes to create contemporary manuscript art on parchment that takes inspiration from the Gaelic origin legend and a range of contemporary themes. So today, Thomas will talk about his practice, which involves the traditional production of parchment made from waste deer skin and pigment made with locally found natural materials. So thank you, Thomas. Over to you.
Thanks for that, Naoko. I'll just get my screen on. Right, can everybody see that? We're
Yep.
good?
Yep.
I think I've hit past the introduction, but I'll not press anything else in case I do something wrong. So we're on to the first slide straight away. So I'm just going to give a summary of my practice, which is currently making insular manuscripts, attempting to do it the same way that was done in the 7th, 8th century when the art form really peaked with things like the Book of Kells. I'll focus this evening mainly on the pigments and the sort of background processes, and that really sort of reflects what I do anyway, because a lot of it's research based. I maybe produce one artwork every 3 months if I was in a rush, but the actual background understanding of what's going on, or where there is evidence, actually turning that into something you can use and then make really tiny and then make stick to parchment, all those little hurdles to cross. That's when you get into the area of really having to experiment with things. And it's really interesting to be joining a network where it's other people doing dyeing and other working with plants and foraging and things, because that's where a lot of my information comes from, because there isn't a lot directly on this. There's a lot in the Celtic revival and other Celtic artists in terms of design that's come on brilliantly. So there's lots of great support. There's lots of great artists out there, but the little bit that I'm going to focus on this evening, where it's the actual put it together as it was back in the 8th, 9th century, there's still quite a lot of that that's not really understood. So I'll focus on that area. So this is, you can see on the screen, one of the choices faced by the insular artists, and this has been quite confusing for art historians, even though it's been answered in the last few years, that there's essentially 2 really good purples locally available in Scotland. One of them comes from the dog whelk, and you get several out of species of lichen that have the pigment orson within them. And really, in terms of chemistry, there's not much to choose between them. They're both light fast, they're both quite good, they're both readily available. And I've been asked by experts and academics why this prevalence for the orson. And it's sort of gives an example into the inner workings of the insular monks, that the answer, and usually when you can find an answer, it's because it's much, much easier. I mean, it really is a matter of convenience. If you spend a day collecting dog whelks, you might get a couple of square inches of pigment, enough to paint a few letters out of. If you did a day out of orson, you would have several lifetimes worth. I'm working from one small jam jar that took me maybe 20 minutes to collect, and that's me probably for the rest of my life. If I do some extra workshops, I might need another jam jar eventually, but it's very, very small scale. I know that a lot of dyers now wouldn't use lichens for environmental reasons, and that's perfectly understandable because of the quantities required there. But if it's talking about insular manuscripts, the volume of pigment involved is absolutely minute. The other advantage to the orson, you can see in this slide, that's a shell with some of the dye extracted. It's literally just soaking the lichen in ammonia for a period of 3 to 4 months. It breaks down, the ammonia goes purple, and you can use that straight, or, which is much more interesting, you can combine it with acids or alkalis, and it functions as a universal indicator. So you can get quite a range of pinks and purples out of it. So in, for example, here, there's some lettering, you can see the pink filling and the purple filling. That's exactly the same lichen. One's had vinegar added to it, one's had a little lime added to it, and that gives you your acid and your alkaline reaction. And in certainly well-known manuscripts, such as the Lindisfarne Gospels, we've got a really distinct range of purples. It's highly likely that it just the one lichen source and then the chemistry on top of it has given them that range. And certainly their control of that is quite impressive. And the fact that they've done this in a way where they've got the foresight to know that, this is going to be stable for a millennium or so and be absolutely fine. And I'm really only confident of my own results when I'm copying them, because you mix these things together and think, is this still going to be stuck in the parchment next week? Never mind in 10, 50, 1,000 years. But certainly if you manage to follow the recipe of the original monks, they really, really had a knack for getting it just right in terms of stability, which is one of the main problems for everybody working with natural pigments and dyes and things. Is even if it looks good on the day, how do you know that that's definitely the answer? And you really don't until years down the line. This is another one that turned out to be quite a surprise. It was in Trinity College, I think about the early 2000s. They did the mass spectrometry testing, on the Book of Kells, and it came out that the blue was woad. And before that, the story was that it's lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and it's this really expensive exotic pigment worth more than gold. You'll still see some books that claim that, but it's pretty universal in insular manuscripts that everything's been tested is indigo, and the nearest source of indigo is woad. That comes with lots of problems. Woad's not particularly stable. It looks good for a while. It's not particularly light fast. It fades really easily. You can see in my 2 samples labeled woad and gypsum there, that well, actually this screen makes them look deceptively good. They're actually a nightmare to work with. They're very grainy. One's too dark, one's too light. They just don't handle very well. So I was stumped on this for a good couple of years, because you had the science telling you it's woad. It has to be woad, but woad's terrible. And I'm just going to play this little video clip now of what I think has turned out to be the answer, which is really quite impressive on the part of the insular monks. What they seem to have done is heated the woad with gypsum. And when you heat the woad with gypsum, it creates a chemical reaction where it drives off a water molecule in the gypsum, and the woad becomes a gas and attaches where that water molecule was. So what they've essentially done is turn an organic pigment into a synthetic pigment. And a similar process for doing this with indigo was patented in the 1800s in the UK. So it gives you an idea of how far ahead they were. And it's quite similar to a process that the Mayans did in the 12th century. And there's the famous color Mayan blue, which is again another incredibly stable one. They did that with their local clay and their local indigo species. So I think this is the answer for the Book of Kells, and I'll move on to the next slide. And so on one side, the more knocked about one, that's the original Book of Kells, and the one on the other side, that's my copy of that page. And for our purposes here, the thing to note there is the different tones of blue throughout it. And as you can see from the previous little video where I was cooking this up in a very, very small little crucible. And that's because you can only really control the temperatures and not burn it at about that scale. So you can only make incredibly small batches. And since the ratios, again, are very, very small, fractions of a gram, you can't really weigh it out accurately with any technique that would be available in medieval times. So consequently, you can't control the color particularly well. And you can see how the artist in the original manuscript has had exactly the same problem, where he's cooked up maybe 4 or 5 batches. And so each cross is a slightly different shade of blue. So by following what I thought they were doing, I've ended up with exactly the same problem and used my darkest just for they had their darkest, and that's given me the same sort of steps. So it's when things like that happen that you get really, really close to the footsteps of the original scribe. But even though, because we can't do invasive tests and things like these, that you can be quite confident that you're close to what they were aiming at and what the original method was. So that's quite a satisfying one. That's something I'm going to bring in when we do the course at the Rockfield Centre. We're going to be using woad in little tiny batches because it really is quite a satisfying little chemical process. So I'm growing woad up here for that now, and there might be some available in the dye garden down there as well. So we can have it really, really local, which is always really good. This is another pigment which I'm currently in a series of debates with numerous academics. Basically, the oak gall ink is what the black is called in all insular manuscripts. I don't believe it existed at all at the time under any set of circumstances. It's an introduced species, so it wasn't here to the 1830s. If they had to import it, that would cause all sorts of problems getting it from Turkey. It would be similar to certainly the problems in the Tudor spice trade and it being worth more than gold, and adulteration and all sorts of things. You couldn't have run an entire monastic writing culture on if your main ingredient was something that was from far away and had to stay dry and was prone to all sorts of interference. So basically, oak bark works just as well. I now make my inks out of oak bark. That's problematic for modern foragers and things. You need permission to chop down an oak tree every now and then. I'm lucky enough on the estate where I've got my studio, I've got permission when an oak tree falls over, I can go and get the bark. And if anybody else is wanting something cut down, there happens to be oak involved, I'm the first one in the queue as well. So I've got my own stash of oak bark. But yeah, it's just a point that it's in all the books, whereas it's just not the case. So this is a facsimile of the Book of Kells page I've done, and I managed to get it tested by Team Pigment at Durham University, who've got the most accurate non-invasive laser in the world. And the peaks on their graph that this page gave is exactly the same as what you get for so-called oak gall ink. So basically even the most accurate tests that show a manuscript has oak gall ink in it, all it's really telling you is it's either oak gall ink or oak bark ink. And if you look at the circumstantial case, oak bark ink is much, much more likely. So that's a point I'm going to keep pushing over the next few years until it gets written down. I'll move on to parchment now. That's what we're going to be using in the project in the workshop in, I think, September. The final piece is going to be in parchment. So we'll be working on parchment, making the inks, and each making a letter from the tree alphabet. And the thing about insular parchment is it's incredibly difficult to define. So I've got a list of things said about it here, and they're all true. It's sometimes suede-like and quite rough. It's sometimes so smooth it appears as if it's been burnished. Sometimes it's white. Sometimes it's really dark. And on a regular basis, it's full of holes. And there's a rumor about split skins. That's another thing I don't believe, because I've tried to split numerous skins and can't do it. Can't see how it can be done. It's like, said, how would you split an A4 sheet of paper down the middle? It's a fiber bundle of material that is organic and does not have a natural way to split. And again, a mythical split skin calf manuscript has never been found. It may exist in sheep, but in terms of insular manuscripts, it's purely calf, and I work on deer for both environmental and reasons of availability. So we'll move on to the next slide and talk about the little holes, because they're actually quite interesting. The very tiny holes found in manuscripts such as the Book of Kells are caused by bacteria. And it turns out that this is a completely unique way of making parchment, where they're actually using, they're still putting skins in lime, which is the process for making parchment is you clean the skins, put them in lime, rinse them, then stretch them on a frame. And in modern parchment, the lime or some other high alkaline is used to expand the skin and make the hair fall out. But it would seem that what they were using the alkaline for was to encourage extremophile bacteria that like that environment, and then getting the bacteria to clean the skin, dehair it, and also make it really, really smooth, because they're literally eating away at the surface. And that's how parchment such as the Book of Kells is really, really smooth, and why they're able to do such detailed work on it. So this is an example of me trying to follow that process. And as you can see, I'm having a bit of problems. Those skins are done about 20 minutes apart. So that's the kind of time window of getting this wrong. And what they had and what we don't have is some way to turn the bacteria off really, really quickly. And again, that's just something they knew. Their knowledge is much, much above ours. You know, theoretically, maybe you could pour a tub of bleach or something on the skin, but that would sort of ruin the principle of the whole thing. But by their methods, no idea how they did it. Still haven't got it. I've got some close by blind chance, but it's just another area that there just are no answers. And they were clearly able to do it in books such as Kells, of, you know, a run of 160 skins, all of them just right, which is quite incredible. And I can't get two in a row. So it just shows the sort of the vast, vast knowledge that's lost and still needs worked on. One thing recently, and this is just at the peninsula, just above me, I'm on the Black Isle. So this is from the archaeology at Tarbet, and the 7th, 8th century monastery there, which happened to have a scriptorium, which they think was attacked by the Vikings and basically left as it was burnt down with all the tools sitting out. So you've got a full parchment maker's toolkit in situ, and just explains what's going on, which on some levels is great. On other levels creates new difficulties, because if you don't really know what's going on, there's no evidence, you can have all your own ideas and put them in there and make your life easy. But when you're forced to confront facts, it's sometimes a bit more difficult. So the tools here, and explaining the ones at the top, that's various pumice stones, are rubbing the parchment down, making it smooth, exactly as we have now. Same with the other smoother stones. The little small pebbles, that's for putting in the corners of the skins to tie strings to make them taut on a frame. And I'll move over to the pins. Again, that's probably for sewing strings in, or sometimes if you get a cut in the parchment, you can sew it up with a little thin strip of parchment or a sinew. Those two bits of bone, they're the bone pegs that would have gone on the frame to tighten the skin with. And the problem here is this little blade, the linellum, which is seen as diagnostic of making parchment. Now, the problem with that is that it's 76 millimeters across. And you see, I've got a picture of my version of it, which is 76, with one that's about 200 millimeters across. Now, the bigger of those two would be considered to be a very, very small linellum, like really at the absolute smallest practical end you could possibly get. A bigger commercial one would be at least twice that size. And the issue is, if you hit a skin with that small one, because of the surface area of it, it just goes through it. It just makes a hole. That's all that happens. It is a terrible linellum for how linellums are used. And after some experimentation, this turns out to be another example of them having a completely unique way of doing things, which turns out to be better than our way of doing things. Also at the Tarbert site where the parchment was made, there was a hearth, which is another strange thing to have around parchment. You don't want too much heat. You certainly don't want too much smoke or ash or anything spitting out, particularly in its final stages. But they've got a hearth right beside where they're processing, where they're stretching the skins. I'll move over and play a little video of putting those bits together. That what they appeared to be doing is heating water, throwing the hot water onto the skins, which is another reason for using the bone pegs, because they don't expand in wooden holes, whereas if you used wooden pegs, they get stuck. So that was, again, it was another strange thing, why to go to all the effort of bone pegs. And ordinarily, if you can see this skin, one side's quite dark and the other side's quite light. Now that dark side, that's called the grain. So that's where the hair would stick on. And that basically would take you maybe a day or two on a large skin to wear down by pure abrasion. So it's a good day or two's work. But with the Tarbert method, which will play now, this is that their linellum works more like a wallpaper scraper. So you heat up one side of the skin and get it wet. Basically the same as scraping wallpaper off a wall. And it kind of lifts and separates it. And you can just rattle through it and get a couple of days work done in a couple of hours. So just, yeah, hidden there is probably the most helpful thing I've learned for my life. To consider to make a lot of parchment that has saved me thousands of hours to have that little bit of knowledge there. And it just sort of shows that that's something that without that archaeology, you would never have guessed that. You wouldn't even have put a parchment area there. It's far too far north. They've got no lime, but it turns out they were using seaweed. Just completely the wrong set of circumstances, but it turns out not only did they make it, but they were doing it better than anybody else. So we'll move on to, so this is the Kells Cairo page. So probably the most complex page ever created, arguably the most complex piece of art ever created at the highest resolution. And on the left of the screen, you can see that's the sort of geometric underdrawing for it. And if you look at the actual rectangle of which all this design hangs off, that's basically a square two rectangle, which we would now know is an A4 sheet of paper. And that's all they need for that design to work. It is the relationship between those two sides expressed as a ratio and constantly subdivided by a compass that give you that entire design. So that is literally all you need is a blank A4 sheet of paper. And that's the instruction set to give you every point in that design, every compass move, every place of every character. So that's them. That's how far they could push geometry. So this is, miles beyond anything anybody's doing, with contemporary work. But it just goes to show that the sheer level by which they could meditate upon one ratio and just move and comfortably move within it. Because even when you get to maybe 10 or 15 moves, it's easy to forget where you're supposed to end up. But this is like hundreds, if not thousands of moves. And there are little points within it where you can stop and restart on a smaller level, and so you don't have to backpedal the whole way. But someone had to have the foresight to a certain degree of this design to execute that, which really is just incredible. There could never be enough said about this page. You could have several presentations just about it, but I'll move on. It's just a particularly good example of the geometry. This is another example. This is local to me. It's about 3-4 miles down the road. The Rosemarkie Cross slab, which is another work of pure geometry, but a much, much simpler one because it was made for public consumption. Whereas the Cairo and Kells, probably only pretty high church members or important people got to look at that for any length of time. And it's quite, for its time, probably quite an academic work to sort of understand all the references and things within it. Whereas this is a public piece of art full of Pictish symbols that had to be understood at the time. Of course, we don't know what the Pictish symbols are anymore, but I'll just do a little run through. This is how this piece works. Again, as a piece of geometry, just all from one circle, one line, and just building it up and subdividing the next 2 points, which gives you a larger circle. And it's really all about what we call the crescent and V rod. It's actually, in this case, there's an intersection of 2 arcs, and the V rod is the set of dividers used for the design. So what you see on the stone is literally when they went to the quarry to cut that stone, that set of dividers at that setting is unit 1 for that. And that for them is enough to just generate the entire design. And that's right down to the finest details. There's a longer version of this in Grome House Museum where the stone's situated. And I also make a video on the other side of the stone, which is exactly the same geometry. It just takes a different course about halfway through. So it gives you the design on the other side of the stone instead. And it's almost like the little Z rod that points an arrow in each direction, just says, you know, once you've checked this side of the stone, you know, have a little peek around the other because it's geometrically exact. It's sort of that they have used the pictus symbols in this case to actually guide you through the geometry to make it quite obvious for you. Still took me months to work it out, but afterwards it was clear that they were trying to make it quite obvious, and that at the time it would probably be quite normal for people to see things geometrically the same way we sort of understand feet and inches and centimeters now. They were very much thinkers in terms of proportion and geometry. Now, move on to, so this is sort of a practical example of why you need geometry. This is a double Euclid spiral used as the inside of a letter N. And this is when it's getting down to the really, really tiny details. And it's sort of the reason why you could never really get into these pages with sort of modern or freehand or modular design techniques. It really, the only way to do it is to follow what the original artists did. I mean, they perfected this craft for hundreds, if not thousands of years, if you go back to all the metal work. And it really, it's inconceivable there'd be another way to get there. So I'll just play a little. So unfortunately, when I'm making these videos on really tiny scale, even though I know I'm filming, the second I start drawing, I completely forget I'm filming and immediately put either my hand or my head in front of it. And this is actually the best out of several attempts. This is the least I got in the way of myself. And you can see here, once you get into the really, really tiny stuff, that geometry just helps you. And it's really only at the very, very end that you start poking in with the quill. But by then there's so little space that there's not much leeway. Because if you started doing that and you were still a few higher resolutions, then you're going to start drifting off by the time you get to those tiny dots. Some are going to be too big, some are going to be too small. So it's really just right at the end when you can't go any further that sort of freehand movements comes into things. And I think they probably did that for a certain level of religious reasons, about getting right to the edge of where there is to understand. So I think they probably saw it in that way. It certainly is. It's a very, very satisfying, if time consuming, way to do things. Another sort of element of my work recently over the last year or two is getting into the old Irish and Gaelic source material, because there's just so much in it. And I've been collaborating with the academic Michael Newton, and we've been working together the last couple of years on things. And this is one just example of a pretty famous old Irish poem. It mentions holly ink, but nobody knows what holly ink is. If you try to make holly ink with water, it's just not very good. And the clue in this poem has turned out to be this particular translation, where it calls it a beetle-hued draft of ink. Some translations just call it a dark blue or dark black draft of ink, but it's the beetle-hued bit, and that refers to iridescence. And when you cook holly bark in ammonia, you basically get iridescence that just looks like beetle shells. And I'll move on to that now. So that is the holly bark cooking in ammonia, and it even still looks quite good on screen, but in real life it literally looks like you've got a little tub full of crushed beetles. It is very, very clear. And I've been refining this more. I've got to go more blue recently, and that's from holly just a few weeks ago. So I'm getting closer to what the poem says it should be. And I'm very confident that, of course, the person that wrote the poem is right. They're using the actual ink and describing what's happening. It's our understanding and chemistry that is lagging and keeping up with them. But yeah, I'm getting closer and closer to that. And this is just a really pleasing example of where hidden within something that it could be just dismissed as a poetic flourish, but really they're just explaining things as they are. And it's turned out to be very, very helpful. I think once I've got more to grips with it, I think it is going to be it takes a while to understand an ink and how to use it and what way to cut your quill, prepare your parchment and all the rest of it. But I think eventually this is going to be a very, very promising ink. This is my sort of outdoor work site, which again, on sort of some of the old Irish poems, they talk about sitting out in the woods doing stuff and what birds are calling, or they're sitting just writing their book in the trees and the blackbird calls and the cuckoo calls. And so I've just been building a site and doing little workshops and cooking up inks with people, and it's just very, very enjoyable. It is definitely preferable to indoor working. So that is my summer setup, and I'll be looking at opportunities to expand that way of working as much as possible. So yeah, I'll move on to some of my actual work now. This is a recent final piece on the story of the birth of Oisin. It's about A4 size in real life, and sort of went for the challenge of getting the entire story of the birth of Oisin into the image. And it's a pretty complicated story. There's like shape shifting and going into caves where have time warps that the person's there for 3 days. It's actually 3 years. And it just gives me an extra level of appreciation of these stories as really heavy engineering. Like when you just hear them as fairy tales, you can kind of dismiss fanciful details and stuff. When you actually try to break them into parts and put them together in a way that works, and then it actually does. And you couldn't really do that with just a, sort of a random kid's story. I mean, these really are carefully thought up things that have lots and lots of really strong visual imagery and turning points and points of focus within them that are very carefully placed. And I'm certainly only starting to get that by going through them really, really slowly and drawing bits out and sort of forcing myself to try and fit them in to spaces like this, and find it to be just really, really enjoyable and really, really learning a lot from them. Probably, unless you've got a massive computer, not even enough scale to see the image much better there, but you can see the close-up of the sort of idea. I think it's about 50 or 60 characters sort of woven into it in bits and pieces, and it's just more or less in order from when Finn sticks his thumb in his mouth to see. It gives him a different vision, and you can see that the woman, you see the deer that he's looking at is actually a woman that's been cursed. So he's got that clearness of vision, which is why there's no color there. That's Oisin's mother, who's turned into a deer, and she has Oisin, and then Oisin meets her in the cave, which warps time. So he thinks he's in there for 3 days, but it's actually 3 years. He has to warn his mother of various hunting hounds chasing her, which is why there's lots of dogs around it. So there's lots of very little subplots and bits and pieces going on within it. This is another different approach to the Tuatha De Danann, the fairy. They're kind of unique in the stories because they're still around. It's still quite common in Ireland to blame things on the fairy. I've certainly know relatives of mine that would cut down anything if not cut down blackthorn because of the fairy and things like that. It's still interesting. They still exist. So give them a kind of graffiti identity, just out sort of knocking about and causing trouble, because they still have that role in our society. I find that quite fascinating, and developing a more contemporary script for stories relating to them. This is some other stories. This Manus and the Sea Hag, one of the tales about the Norse coming over to invade Ireland, and the other one's about the Fana in a cave. They're supposed to be dormant in a cave somewhere in Scotland, and a horn has to be blown to wake them up. And yeah, just mucking about with the different ways you can use parchments. For both of these, I've been cutting holes in the parchment and having a different page behind, and other things going on in that. And it's a really versatile material. So I've been just mucking about for those days. And we'll finish on this one. It's probably one of the most sort of contemporary ones. I don't do many like this, but every now and then there's an idea that just sort of sits in what's happening. So this is to do with sort of Extinction Rebellion and the tree of life and the world being on fire and all the things around us at the moment. I thought it was just quite appropriate for a mix between graffiti and the traditional style. So that one's on an A5 scale. So again, just a bit of a issue to make everything really, really small. Actually harder to do the graffiti small than anything else, because I'm not used to that. It's usually on using your arm as the compass point, if anything, to pivot it off. So making it really, really tiny and still look right is quite a challenge. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I think we're ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That's fascinating. It's great to know that more in depth details what you're doing in your practice. And well, I thought few things. Well, many things, but how to understand the heritage. I don't know if heritage is the right word, but how to understand that. But your way is that to understand it by going through the process yourself. You know, you when you come across something very old or historical, and then to understand it, you actually to make it from the material, and then you kind of get different dimension of understanding. You know what you're saying, that okay, so that's why these two parts, even though the shapes are the same, why the color is really subtly different, because there is a technical reason to it. The making a batch of ink is so difficult, so it kind of, you understand that way. And then also how you pass on the tradition, that I really admire your way, because you pass on the tradition not by just, how can I say, the pass on what was happened in the past, but also your way is that you interpret by yourself. So you interpret, you add on your contemporary interpretation, which is how, in my opinion, how this tradition, how to make tradition alive, if you know what I mean. And then that's kind of thing we are talking about when we are developing our EcoCreatives project. Actually, it's our contemporary interpretation towards what is very, very traditional. The dyeing is very traditional technique. It happened for a long time. But anyway, sorry. I think to everybody, it's probably great time for you to think about if you have some questions to Thomas, and then do feel free to pop in your questions in the chat box, because I'll ask a few questions to Thomas first. So it's probably your time to think about a few if you have some. So I'll ask just a few questions to you, Thomas. So you are based in Cromarty, which is a small community located at the top of the Black Isle Peninsula in the Scottish Highlands. And how does your practice relate to your or engage with your locality?
I'm totally dependent on it. With Cromarty Arts Trust, I've got my studio, but they're also very, very understanding. I mean, I've got a lot of space that isn't my studio outside that they let me have, and I'm always dragging in dead animals and various things, having big fires, smelting lead, that sort of stuff. And that's far beyond the little artist brief that I've got. You know, I've got a rental agreement to sit in the studio and paint stuff and not make too much mess on the floor. But I've got like a parchment area built and a furnace and an outside space and all of that. It's the land manager, Gail, of the estate, as a trustee. She's also into tanning and skinning and crofting background. She just understands it. So they just totally understand my practice, which is cool because a lot of people don't, basically. And again, in the local community, if there's anything roadkill, I'll get a text so I can get deer and stuff pretty quickly. And it's the game dealers up in Ardguy I'll get most of my skins off. So yeah, I mean, it's completely dependent on the cooperation of the local community. And then obviously there's just there's lots of deer, there's lots of oak trees, there's lots of natural resources, and there isn't really anybody else after them from the same angle. So I don't have any like direct competition. It's not like I'm destroying all the lichens. I need a very, very tiny amount. I know where it is, and there's nobody else specifically after those things in the same way. So it's a really good setup for me that's really allowed me to do this from a practical point of view. That it just wouldn't work in a city. I don't think I could do this in a city.
Yeah, in the city, you can't really drag the deer skin. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
There are lots of creatives living in Cromarty. I know that it's quite creative community, isn't it?
Yeah, there are a few artists here. I mean, there's another sort of 5 artists in the complex I'm in, and then there's several other artists in the village, and then the Arts Trust have lots of events. There'll be a lot of musicians and things like that. So yeah, it is. It definitely is.
Oh, okay, great. I like what you're saying, that depending on the community, but the kind of interdependency. I think you say that you're depending on them, but I think the community also, in a way, that depending on the creative practitioners.
Well,
like
I
you.
mean, there's some people who are very happy to have a dead deer taken away from their house. So it works both ways. So some people are almost as happy as I am to get rid of it. So.
Oh, that's great. Okay, thank you. So my next question is that a lot of your material comes from natural environment, and you use ancient techniques developed 1,000 years ago, and the state of the environment has changed a lot since then, and the climate is still changing. Does this environmental shift somehow affect your practice? And if so, then how are you responding to this?
Again, if anything, for the particular niche I'm in, and I am obviously worried about and against climate change and all the things we're doing in the environment, but the actual imbalances that are in the environment around me at the moment are there's too many deer by some distance who are destroying all the trees, therefore being culled. There's no industry or craft keeping up with the use of skins, so the skins have no value. So I'm getting something that in medieval times you'd have your hands chopped off for even touching if you didn't own it, whereas now we just don't value it. And that I mean, it's terrible because so many deer skins are going to waste, but as an individual that uses deer skins, it helps me greatly because my main resource is essentially free. And it's worrying in some ways that we're treating things like that. I mean, that's not a good sign of how society is if things that are this valuable, this useful, are not valued economically or in any other way. But on the practical level of actually getting things done, it's helping me currently. But that does change. That's it's great to get started off. If in 20 years deer skins are being treated the same way as they are now, then we've got a big problem.
So that means that a long time ago, medieval times, deer had predator of them?
Deer would have had natural predators, but also been property of the crown and forests. So the Lord would have controlled them and the hunting rights and things. And when you had wolves about and bears, up to the 1700s. So it's quite recent, the way, and just the way we manage the land now. It suits particularly roe deer, can spread really fast. They're really good, really adaptable, really clever, really good at adapting to agricultural changes and things. So they're, the roe deer are doing really well off the back of the problems we're causing. And there's too many of them. And I'm doing well out of there being too many of them. But yeah, these are short-term things and not good signs. But yeah, there could be a lot more people using deer skins. It's certainly not a crowded field at the moment.
I see. Well, thank you. My last question is, to weave this natural dye network further, can you give us a name of one practitioner who you are already in connection with and who uses similar natural dye techniques?
Yes, I'm going to mention Caroline Ross, who's an artist who does a lot of stuff with foraging and also tanning, and she's moved into parchment making as well. I worked with her on a book project a couple of years ago. And she sent me some pigments. So I used the madder that she made as one of my pigments. And yeah, so keep means to get up here, and we're going to do some parchment stuff. But yeah, it's an artist I've been in contact with, and it's good to be in contact with people who kind of have that broader focus, because I get quite sort of tunnel vision on my niche, which sometimes you need to, but can also sometimes it's hearing what other people are up to in the broad picture that is often much more helpful, and it's not always immediate. You don't always find it's not always immediately helpful. It's later on you realize that it was helpful. And yeah, it's something I've just got to be conscious of. And I could quite happily sit for months in the forest and make manuscripts never come out, but it would yeah, you do need the network, and you do need the spread out.
Yeah. No, I can see that kind of how can I say, exchange between practitioners. For instance, when I talk to you and Deborah at the same time, I can see that happening between you. So that's I can see that.
Yes, even the birch leaf yellow is something I'm already particularly interested in. Unidentified yellows and insular manuscripts. So I am particularly excited by the colours Deborah's getting off the birch.
That's great. And the Caroline, Caroline, yeah, where she's based?
She's down in Dorset.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'll look up her later on. So I talked enough, I think. So let's open up the floor to invite more questions. And I'm not the best person to lead things quickly, so Verity, can you help me to?
Yeah, awesome. Thomas, if you can stop sharing your screen just so we can see your lovely face a little bit larger.
Good idea.
Perfect, and then I'll just pin you here. So we've got a question from Susan Martin, who says, can you tell us some of the materials you use to create your coloured inks? So maybe some other examples than you used in the presentation.
Sure. So there's woad is the blue to been through. The green is copper acetate. So that's vinegar mixed with copper. So just 2 peas and Tesco white vinegar is the easiest way to do it. Leave it on a windowsill if it gets warm. It'll go green after a few days to a week, and then dry it out. That'll make crystals and just crush them up. It's a really easy one. The red is lead oxide, lead tetroxide, which is an absolute nightmare of a process to make. It takes months and months from raw lead, but you can buy it. Very, very toxic though. So I just use it for traditional reasons. And also it's a really, really good pigment. It handles really well, particularly detailed work. The white is gypsum, which is quite strange. That's something I've still not got to the bottom of, because to make red lead, you need to make white lead first, and white lead is much better than gypsum. So as to why they would have had the white lead, cooked it to made red lead and not saved any for their white, and then used this horrible grainy mineral for their white, I still don't know. I cannot get to the bottom of that, but they do, so I do. The yellow, the identified yellow, that is arsenic sulfide. There are other unidentified yellows. The problem being, since they're organic, we don't have a way to test them, and also they might not definitely have been yellow. That's another problem. You see browns and yellows and things like that that are organic. They could have changed, but from all the pigments that we're certain of, they certainly had a knack for making things stable. So I'd certainly trust them and go on the side of the fence that I think it probably is supposed to be a yellow, even if it's changed a bit. I'm trying to think what other colors there are. Purple, that's the lichens, covered that. I think it's a pretty limited palette. I mean, they do a lot of the red, yellow, blue, green, white, black. Yeah, that is pretty much it in insular manuscripts. And the purple, and yeah, just those quite harsh primary colors and nothing too subtle.
Thank you. And then we have another question from Deborah, who says, you've given a couple of examples where your exploration of techniques has led you to doubt the accepted explanations of the practices and materials used by the original manuscript illuminators. How has that affected your standing with your contemporaries?
So far, so good. I went to the Insular Art Conference and did a sort of basically lecture on what I thought the pigments were, and then basically the people that are the most accurate measures of pigments were there, and I got my pigments tested, and all the graphs came up with what they were supposed to be. So it's gone pretty well, basically, because it's not, I mean, I'm not, saying anything completely revolutionary. I'm just saying it's a quercetanic acid to galactanic acid, and they're two things that are chemically very similar. It's just the problem is that there's not all disciplines and areas are in necessarily communication. So a lot of, when I'm focusing things on making a manuscript and pulling sources in from that angle, I might have started off from an ecological angle, learning about oak gall wasps and that they're introduced, and then go into the chemistry. Whereas the chemistry can't tell you whether it's an oak gall wasp or an oak tree, but there's a received wisdom that it's an oak gall wasp. But really, the bits of the jigsaw puzzle, when you put them all together and focus on making a manuscript, it's, you're not really saying anything too controversial. It's just kind of tidying up bits of science that exist that haven't really been interlinked. So it's not nothing too dramatic.
Thank you. And then we've got a question from John. When painting insular knotwork, are there techniques you have found to work better than others?
Yes.
Do you have evidence of how the scribes were painting, for example? Did they paint overlapping layers where the pattern overlaps, or did they paint it more two-dimensionally?
Definitely painting two-dimensionally. They don't really deal, how they get the effect of 3D is by changing resolution. So there's parts of the design are done at a different scale. So you'll make your geometry and make everything into tiny, divide it up and subdivide into sets of squares. And some squares are smaller than others. So that'll give you the depth effect. And also parchment itself is slightly translucent. So it makes the design look like it's sitting slightly off the page. So I don't think they would ever, even though some of the manuscripts are damaged, so you can't be 100% certain, like the Book of Kells got badly restretched at one point. So apparently there was a layer above it that's been damaged, but I don't think there's any evidence for shading or things like that. Aidan Meehan is the person to go to, I think, for knotwork. I think he's cracked it in terms of technique. George Bain had it that you did little dots and joined the dots up, whereas with Aidan Meehan, essentially you go between the dots. And I think that's the way to do it. And it also helps you get smaller more neatly.
Thomas, if you can type in the names, that might be.
Sure.
Yeah, that would be great. And then does anyone have any other questions they'd like to ask? Oh, here we go. We've got another one. I'll give you a minute, Thomas, and then I'll ask you. Oh, there we go. Sheena wanted to ask, had you made any or thought about making your own tools for the particular purpose? Because she was interested to hear about the material culture from the monastery and the scriptorium site.
Well, basically, other than metalwork, other than iron metalwork, I do make my own tools. So the only thing I'm not currently making is the stuff that takes proper blacksmithing. So, because you basically can't buy them, they don't exist. So I make my own frames to stretch them on, quills and benches and huts and desks and all the rest of it. Because just, and even things like clam shells and oyster shells and mussel shells are actually much better as paint containers, particularly on the scale you're working, because the way they've got that little shallow curve, you can pull out the paint to get the exact viscosity you need, much better than any modern container. I mean, you just could not go to a shop and buy something that good. So yeah, I am all for making my own tools the way they did it. Usually it turns out to be better. There's very little things in my day-to-day practice where I think, oh, I really like the modern version. I mean, pipettes would be the only exception, because it's really nice to be able to lift really small amounts of stuff. I can't find their equivalent of that. But other than that, the traditional ways, particularly on a really small scale, are more effective. So I make the tools for that reason, as well as curiosity, but it usually is more practical as well.
And does anyone have any last questions before we finish up? We've got a lot of thank yous for you, Thomas.
Thanks everybody for coming, especially on a sunny evening.